It is December 22nd, 2000, and inside a federal bankruptcy court in Chicago, one of the largest boat builders on the planet is being carved into pieces. Outboard Marine Corporation, the company behind Evinrude, Johnson, and 13 different boat brands stitched together over 3 decades of acquisitions, has just filed for Chapter 11. 7,000 employees are about to lose their jobs in a single stroke. Lawyers are already drawing up lists of assets, factories, tooling, trademarks, and somewhere inside that dying corporate machine sits a small aluminum boat brand out of Lebanon, Missouri, a brand built 30 years earlier by a husband and wife who started with nothing but a welding torch and a handful of local hires willing to learn on the job. Nobody in that Chicago courtroom is thinking about them. To the people dividing up the wreckage, Lowe Boats is just a line item, one brand among dozens waiting to be auctioned to whoever bids highest. Within weeks, attorneys in Minneapolis will be fighting over exactly what happens to it, whether it survives or gets folded into the liquidation along with everything else OMC built too fast and understood too little. To understand why Lowe walks out of that courtroom still standing, you have to go back 4 decades to a small Missouri town and a man most boaters today have never even heard of. His name is J.B. Appleby, and by the mid-1960s, people inside the aluminum boating world already talk about him like a legend. He starts small, building what the industry calls car toppers, flat-bottom John boats and canoes light enough to strap to the roof of a pickup truck, out of a company called Rich Line in the tiny town of Richland, Missouri. There is nothing glamorous about this work. It is sheet aluminum, rivets, and long hours in a shop with no name recognition outside a 50-mile radius. But Appleby moves the operation a short distance to Lebanon and renames it Appleby Manufacturing, and something about the timing, the material, and the man's stubborn attention to weight and hull design starts to click. In its very first year, 1960, the company sells 1,300 boats. 4 years later, Appleby is producing more than 30,000 boats annually and is officially declared the largest maker of aluminum boats in the entire United States. A man with no formal engineering training has, in half a decade, become the single most important name in a material the boating industry barely respected a generation earlier. Boaters and dealers start calling him, informally but permanently, the father of aluminum boating. Building an empire and holding on to one, though, are 2 entirely different skills, and Appleby only ever mastered the first. In 1964, a New York holding company called Standard Industries buys Appleby Boats outright, and the man who built it from scratch becomes, overnight, an employee inside his own creation. His daughter, Deanna, has grown up around this business her entire life, boating quite literally in her blood, the daughter of the man credited with inventing the modern aluminum John boat, raised around welders and hull molds instead of ordinary childhood distractions. She and her husband, Carl Lowe, keep the operation running day to day under the new corporate ownership, still using the Appleby name, still turning out boats on the same Lebanon production lines her father built with his own hands. For nearly a decade, that arrangement holds. Then in the mid-1970s, Standard Industries collapses into bankruptcy, and it drags Appleby Boats down with it. The company that once built more aluminum boats than anyone on the planet simply ceases to exist, absorbed into a bankruptcy filing that has nothing whatsoever to do with boats, decided by people in New York who never once set foot in the Lebanon shop. Carl and Deanna do not walk away from boat building after watching that happen. They walk toward it a second time, on terms they control completely. In 1971, while the old Appleby operation is still nominally running inside its corporate parent, Carl and Diana Lowe start something entirely their own in the same town of Lebanon, Lowe Line. There is no factory handed to them this time, no father's legacy to simply inherit and coast on. There is a welding torch, a handful of local hires, and a philosophy Carl repeats for the rest of his life. Don't import experienced labor from somewhere else. Grow your own from the ground up. We brought in local people and trained them on site, he says. An experienced welder shows a beginner the technique after his shift ends, and the beginner practices on his own time, welding scrap metal in the evenings until he's good enough to actually go on the production line. It is slow, it is deliberate, And it produces a workforce that understands aluminum boat construction from the inside out, not from a training manual handed down by some distant parent company that has never touched a torch. The bet pays off almost as soon as the company finds its footing. In its debut model year of 1972, Lowe Line rolls out 29 separate versions of flat-bottom and semi-V John boats and canoes, an almost absurd range for a company barely a year old, but one that reveals exactly what Carl and Diana are building. Not a single boat, but a full catalog covering every kind of water a working family might actually find themselves on, from a farm pond to a wide Ozark lake. 3 years later, in 1975, Lowe introduces what the company calls the world's first specialized base boat, staking out a category that will eventually become one of the most fiercely competitive corners of the entire recreational marine industry. And Lowe gets there before almost any other aluminum builder in the country, years ahead of competitors who will spend the next decade chasing the same idea. By the end of the decade, the company has outgrown its origins as a builder of basic utility craft. In 1979, Lowe brings a genuinely new idea to the pontoon market. Something more feature-rich, more comfortable, easier for an ordinary family to actually enjoy spending a full day on, rather than just a floating deck bolted across two aluminum tubes. The pontoon line catches on fast enough that it starts to redefine the company's identity. And in 1980, Lowe Line quietly drops the line and becomes simply Lowe, a small rebrand that signals something much larger. A shift from a regional builder of utility boats into a company with a real, recognizable identity spanning multiple categories on the water. 2 years later, in 1982, Lowe pushes further into performance hulls, launching its first deep V design, the Lunker 3 16-footer, proving the same welders who once learned their trade building flat-bottom John boats can now build something engineered for speed and rough water alike. For most of the 1980s, Lowe grows the way a well-run family business is supposed to grow, steadily, reinvesting in its own people, expanding its lineup without ever losing the reliability that made it trustworthy in the first place. Then, in 1988, the very kind of corporate force that once nearly destroyed Lowe's predecessor comes calling again. Except this time it arrives as an acquisition rather than a collapse. Outboard Marine Corporation, the engine and boat conglomerate behind Evinrude and Johnson Motors, purchases Lowe outright. For a smaller regional boat builder, being absorbed into a Fortune 500 marine giant could easily have meant losing everything distinctive about the brand. The local hiring, the on-the-job welding apprenticeships, the entire culture Carl and Diana spent 17 patient years building out of a single Missouri workshop. Instead, remarkably, Lowe keeps innovating almost without interruption under its new corporate parent, as though the acquisition barely touches the factory floor at all. In 1992, Lowe introduces the first aluminum deck boat ever built, the Lowe 2200 QR Silhouette, taking a hull style previously associated almost exclusively with fiberglass construction and proving it can be built just as well in the material Lowe has specialized in from day one. 2 years later, in 1994, working directly alongside professional river guides, commercial operators, boat dealers, and its own engineering team, Lowe launches what becomes its most enduring product line to date, the heavy-duty Roughneck series, boats purpose-built for the kind of relentless commercial and hunting use that ordinary recreational hulls were never designed to survive. Boats meant to be dragged over rocks, loaded with gear, and run hard season after season without complaint. By 1999, Lowe consolidates its Roughneck, Sea Nymph, and Sun Cruiser product lines under one unified Lowe name, strengthening the brand into a single, cohesive identity right as the ground underneath its parent company begins, quietly, to crack. Because OMC, the corporate giant that swallowed Lowe 11 years earlier, is dying. Through the late 1990s, the company hemorrhages money on a badly engineered new outboard motor technology, loses ground to Japanese manufacturers it once dominated without question, and cycles through a series of ownership changes that leave it financially hollowed out from the inside. OMC files for bankruptcy on December 22, 2000, laying off 7,000 employees in a single stroke. For a moment, every brand under that corporate umbrella, Lowe included, becomes nothing more than an asset in a liquidation proceeding, a name on a spreadsheet waiting to be sold to the highest bidder in a Chicago courtroom, indistinguishable on paper from the failed motor technology that dragged the whole company under. In February of 2001, the boat division of OMC is won by Genmar Holdings, the Minneapolis-based company run by Irwin Jacobs, while the Evinrude and Johnson engine brands go to an entirely separate buyer. Lowe does not vanish into a shuttered factory the way so many other OMC casualties do that winter. It gets picked up, reopened, and kept running under its own name inside Genmar's much larger portfolio of boat brands. A portfolio that, within a decade, faces its own reckoning. In 2009, in the depths of the financial crisis, Genmar itself files for Chapter 11, and the aluminum boat brand that survived one bankruptcy in 2000 has to find its footing through a second one, less than 10 years later, watched again by lawyers deciding which brands are worth keeping and which are worth selling for scrap. It does again. Lowe emerges from the Genmar collapse and eventually lands where it remains today, inside Brunswick Corporation, the same marine conglomerate that owns Sea Ray, Boston Whaler, and, in one of the industry's stranger small ironies, Bayliner, the brand that became a national punchline for exactly the kind of affordable, high-volume boat building Lowe had quietly specialized in since its very first year on the water. By 2012, under Brunswick's ownership, Lowe's boat group reaches net sales of $1 billion, a figure that would have been unimaginable to the small crew of local welders, training on scrap metal in Lebanon 4 decades earlier, back when the entire operation was a torch, a shed, and 2 people willing to bet everything on a material most of the industry still doubted. What makes Lowe's survival worth telling is not that it eventually got bigger. Bigger companies, with far more capital behind them, OMC itself among them, disappeared entirely in the same string of collapses that Lowe walked through not once but twice. What kept Lowe standing was something closer to what it started with back in 1971. A workforce trained from the ground up rather than imported, a product line built around what ordinary families and working fishermen actually needed on the water, and a brand identity strong enough that 2 separate parent companies, watching everything else around them fail, still saw something worth reopening the doors for rather than shutting down for good. That is not luck. That is a company that never stopped behaving on the factory floor, like it still had something to prove. There is a version of this story where J.B. Appleby's name is the one everybody remembers, the man once called the father of aluminum boating, whose first company got swallowed by a distant holding company and disappeared within a decade of the sale, a cautionary tale rather than a legacy. And there is the version that actually happened, where his daughter and her husband took everything they learned watching that first company die, built something new 50 miles down the same Missouri highway, and made it durable enough to outlast not 1 corporate collapse, but 2, and to keep standing through a third owner entirely. More than 50 years after Carl and Diana Lowe hired their first local welder and told him to practice on scrap metal until he was ready, the boats still carry the family name. Not because nothing ever went wrong, because when everything did twice over, somebody always found a reason to keep building.